This is the greatest Magneto story that we're ever going to cover on this channel. This is Marvel Mythos X-Men. So what this does here is this opens up with Magneto killing a whole bunch of bigots. And the whole thing here is he says, they say history is written by the winners. Let's have a history lesson. Florida, 1958. A young black man named Edgar Myers is tied to a tree, flogged with barbed wire, and subsequently lynched by white supremacists for refusing to leave his suburban home. Wisconsin, 1997. A teenager named Matthew White is suspended from a bridge by 4 members of his high school football team and struck by a passing train. Matthew White is gay. His murderers receive a suspended jail sentence. 4 days ago, a 12-year-old girl named Sarah Cullen, who has developed a third vestigial arm near her uppermost left rib, is kidnapped by 3 red-blooded American youths and thrown from the back of their moving pickup truck to a chorus of "Have a nice day, Mutie." The child is pronounced dead upon her arrival at a local hospital. Now here's where things get cool, right? Here's where things get amazing, because he says, speaking of red blood, let's also make this a biology lesson. Do you know why blood is red? Because it's full of iron. And these guys are like begging for their lives while this is happening. That's one of the things to know, man. This is almost like God loves, man kills. Magneto pulls no punches. He says, that's not very much iron, roughly 5 grams, enough to fashion a small nail. Even so, imagine if a mutie had the power to extract all the iron from your blood by literally magnetizing the atoms and drawing them outside your body. That'd be a particularly painful way to die. Pulling all the iron out of this guy's body. And he says, oh, go ahead and cry. That's it. Tell me how sorry you are. So was Sarah. And like, this dude dies on the spot, 1 down. And he says, I would imagine she cried as you grinned at her with your rotten teeth and your metal fillings. I would imagine she said, please don't kill me. You had all the power to pull the trigger or spare her life. What would a red-blooded American boy do? And that's when he like sends this guy flying, treats the nail like a bullet, and says bang, fires this thing off and kills all 3 with a combination of just treating a nail like a bullet and stringing them up with barbed wire. Now at that point, you switch over to the assembly of the X-Men, which is to say Xavier sending the team out into the field. And the reason why is because he's sending them to Cape Citadel. What is Cape Citadel? Longtime readers of Marvel Comics will tell you this is the first time the X-Men fight Magneto, because Marvel Mythos was designed to be an entry point for various teams, the Hulk, Avengers, X-Men, the whole 9 yards. But what he does is, because this is their first outing, he tells the X-Men, this is your chance to use your training in a live combat simulation. But understand here, Magneto is more dangerous than anything I could ever dream up in a simulation. This guy is not some pre-programmed series of combat trials. This is a thinking, feeling, autonomous machine. He's limited by nothing other than his imagination. He will be unpredictable, and the level of power he has, you have never faced before. And so that's why he says it's entirely possible that on this mission, you could die. And that's when you switch to Magneto invading Cape Citadel. This guy shows up here, just to show you how amazing this is. This dude shows up here, 1, with an electromagnetic force field around him, so bullets aren't gonna penetrate, because humanity's never really faced off a guy like him, so they don't really know exactly how to counter his abilities. But 2, he's like surrounded by tanks, and he's just flinging these things all over the place, killing every single human being he can find. Magneto's ruthless in the early days. It's one thing to know, man. Magneto nowadays is a lot more toned down. You go and you read like the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Arnold Drake, Gary Friedrich, Roy Thomas comics from like the 1960s. This guy took no prisoners, man. Like, he would just invade a base, kill everyone, and leave. But he doesn't. He's actually hunting for something in particular. Now, the funny thing about this is that he just casually disregards the X-Men. While they're like showing up here and doing what they can to combat him, he's just like sending file cabinets, giant pieces of metal. The whole building is just being used as a weapon, firing off against these guys, and he's just sorting through files while it happens. They're just secondary here. Now, the other thing to keep in mind though is that the X-Men are very inexperienced. At this point in time, they're still basically teenagers, so they don't really know how to counter his abilities. And so while Jean Grey and all these guys are pinned, Magneto finally locates what he's looking for, which is housed inside of a safe. And Xavier, realizing that he has to step in, does exactly that. And this is when you get to one of the absolute best parts of this entire story, because you will see this in X-Men 97, and if the MCU is smart, you will see it in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So what you get here is this discussion between these two guys, and Magneto really presents this notion that like there is a kind of force out there controlling things. Now Xavier counters by saying like there's no puppet master, Eric, right? There's no evil dictatorship at work in the corridors of power. Mutants are human beings. Mutants are Americans who cast votes alongside everybody else. Xavier is relying on the rights assigned to Americans by the United States Constitution and different things like that. But the kicker here, and from Magneto's perspective, like what Xavier's talking about are intangibles. Rights are not a tangible thing. I guess they're tangible insofar as like you can speak, right, and different things like that. But like if somebody walked up to you and said, put your right to free speech in my hand, you wouldn't be able to do it. And so because it's some intangible thing that exists out there in the ether, which is really only guaranteed by people's belief in it, people's understanding of its value, and like ink on paper, it can be stripped away like that. And that's almost what happened here, that the government tried to pass something called the Mutant Registration Act. Now, that's not what Magneto is talking about. What Magneto is basically talking about is Project Wide Awake, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But the Mutant Registration Act was an attempt by the federal government to pass legislation to restrict the civil liberties of mutants, to effectively treat them like second-class citizens, to essentially catalog them and all that kind of stuff, but to do it legally. Now, the United States Supreme Court shot all of it down, and in fact, in the story Days of Future Past, the exact same thing happened. But unlike Days of Future Past, which saw the launch of the Sentinel program and everything going sideways, what Magneto says is that was a smokescreen. But the Mutant Registration Act would have been designed to simply just legalize what the federal government was already doing. And where the X-Men are mobilized and getting ready to attack, Xavier's like, no, stand down. What are you talking about? Right? And that's where Magneto's like, you really don't have any idea what's going on, do you? Right? Like sitting up there in your ivory tower, believing in the best of humanity makes you blind to the reality of humanity. And that's kind of the difference between like Magneto and Xavier, if you wanted to get into a philosophical interpretation. That Xavier, I wouldn't say is naive, but Xavier chooses to believe in the best of humanity. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, in fact, the world needs more people like that, Xavier takes it a step further by almost kind of ignoring the worst of humanity, or simply saying some of the worst things humanity has done, it's never going to happen again because humanity has learned. But what Magneto says here is this smokescreen came in the form of Wide Awake, right? That's the whole point. All this Mutant Registration Act would have done was made Project Wide Awake completely legal. But as it stands right now, it's been going on for 3 years. And with the Mutant Registration Act shut down, Project Wide Awake cannot operate legally. So it does operate in the corridors and in the shadows and behind the scenes in places that people like you don't bother to look because you just assume that there's nothing there. But I have looked and I know that it is there. Now, what's Project Wide Awake? Project Wide Awake is one of the greatest concepts in Marvel Comics when it comes to the X-Men mythos. Project Wide Awake was a multifaceted governmental program that basically stretched from the highest echelons of the federal government, from the President of the United States, all the way down to like state and local sheriff's offices, right? It involved the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, multiple unidentified intelligence agencies. The whole goal behind it was to contain and to control. And so what Magneto reveals is like, the federal government's been taking our DNA for years. So sure, like the Mutant Registration Act does not allow them to legally assign numbers to us, so they just do it behind the scenes. They track us, they catalog us, they know what our powers are. We are basically cattle. That's how the federal government treats us, but it's been kept behind the scenes and under the radar. Were you so tapped into the real world, living in the same reality that we all live in, you would have known this. And so what he says is there is a news helicopter on its way here because some quote-unquote anonymous source tipped them off to the fact that this military installation is actually a covert DNA testing site, and this information is going to be given to them. Now, the question of whether or not Magneto is a reliable source is called in by Jean Grey, who's like, you literally killed everybody on this base. And his response here is very striking. He says, well, you've got me there, young lady. If you call an act of retaliation against a corrupt government murder, then I'm guilty as charged. And he just takes off and hands the information over to the news. Funny enough, knowing the history of the X-Men, nothing comes of this. But it's a phenomenal story, guys. I mean, that's basically it, but it's a phenomenal story. But if you guys ever want to get caught up on the X-Men, make sure you click this link to the playlist. It'll teach you everything you need to know. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.